What did a home look like in the Mongol Empire about 800 years ago, at the height of the largest land empire the world had ever seen? Many people imagine conquerors riding endlessly across the grasslands and sleeping wherever the night found them, as if the Mongols lived in a world without true houses, without domestic order, without rooted family life. But that image is far too simple, because if you had stepped inside a Mongol home in the 13th century, you would not have found chaos. You would have found structure, warmth, discipline, memory, a way of living so intelligent and so closely adapted to the land that even the empire itself begins to make more sense when you understand the house. The first surprise is this: the most famous Mongol house was not made to remain in one place. It was built to move. To us, a house feels complete only when it stands still, when it sinks into the ground with stone, brick, and weight. But to the Mongols, a dwelling did not need to be fixed in order to be real. It had to be strong enough to resist bitter winds, warm enough to preserve life in winter, light enough to be taken apart, and ordered enough to gather a family around a single center. That house was the gyr, often called a yurt in the wider world. Round, portable, and covered in felt, it was not a temporary shelter in the modern sense. It was a true home, and in many ways, a more deliberate one than many permanent buildings. Stay to the end, because once you understand how these homes worked, the Mongol Empire stops looking like a miracle of pure violence and begins to look like something else as well. A civilization shaped by climate, movement, household discipline, and a deep knowledge of what was truly essential. The first impact when entering a Mongol home did not come from ornament or size. It came from the feeling of enclosure. Outside, the steppe was enormous, exposed, and almost frightening in its openness. Wind moved without permission. Distances were measured not by streets or walls, but by horizon and weather. Yet the moment you crossed the threshold of a gyr, the world changed. The air was warmer. The space narrowed into order. The circle of the walls gathered everything inward. What had been endless became intimate. The gyr was circular, not rectangular. That alone changed the experience of being inside it. There were no corners for cold air to collect in, no hard angles interrupting movement, no sense of wasted space. The walls were formed by a folding wooden lattice, light enough to be collapsed and carried, but strong enough when expanded to create a firm circular frame. From that frame rose roof poles that leaned upward toward a central crown, the opening at the top that admitted light and allowed smoke to escape. Over this skeleton were laid thick layers of felt, usually made from sheep's wool, then bound and tightened with ropes. In some seasons, there could be additional coverings, depending on weather, wealth, and need. The result was a dwelling that could breathe, insulate, and endure. To modern eyes, felt may sound fragile, but on the steppe, felt was a technology of survival. It held warmth in winter and moderated heat in summer. It could be rolled, repaired, replaced, dried, and reused. It belonged to the life of the herd, and so the house itself was linked to the animals that sustained the family. Wool became wall. Wall became protection. Protection became time. Another night survived. Another winter endured. This is one of the keys to understanding domestic life in the Mongol world. Their homes were not separate from the economy of the household. The same animals that gave milk, meat, transport, and wealth also gave the raw material for the house itself. A home was not something bought from strangers or inherited from a distant market. It was built from a chain of labor the family understood in their own hands: herding, shearing, cleaning wool, making felt, shaping wood, sewing coverings, binding ropes, painting supports, repairing cracks, tightening the structure before a storm. The house did not descend from outside. It emerged from life itself. And then there was the door. In many Mongol traditions, the door of the gyr faced south. This was not random. It was practical, and it was also cultural. Orientation mattered. Entering the house was not just a matter of stepping inside. It meant entering a moral space, a space with direction, custom, and invisible rules. The threshold was not to be treated carelessly. One did not stamp across it as if entering a barn. One crossed into a place of order. That order began to reveal itself immediately. To a modern person, a single-room circular dwelling may sound primitive or cramped. But inside the gyr, each part of the space had meaning. The north, opposite the entrance, was the place of honor. Important guests might be seated there. Sacred or valued objects could be placed there. It was the symbolic high point of the house, the farthest point from the door. the quiet center of dignity. The west side was often associated with the male sphere, where items related to riding, hunting, or status could be kept. The east side was associated with the female sphere, where food, utensils, and the work of domestic preparation were more closely ordered. At the center stood the hearth or stove, and around that center the life of the household revolved. There were no hallways, no separate bedrooms, no private offices, no closets packed with things no one had touched in years. There was one room, but it was not one undivided blur. It was a map. A child growing up there learned direction almost as a form of character. Where to sit, where not to sit, what belonged to whom, which objects were handled with care, where guests were received, how movement itself reflected respect. The house taught people without words. It demanded attention from everyone because in a small, ordered world, disorder had weight. The floor underfoot was not the polished floor of a palace, though palaces did exist in some Mongol-ruled cities. In an ordinary jur, the ground might be packed earth, sometimes covered with layers of felt, rugs, skins, or carpets, depending on wealth and season. To modernize, this could appear simple, but simplicity on the step was not the same as lack of thought. The floor had to insulate, to remain dry, to support daily labor, and to transform according to the hour. A place used for sitting by day could become a sleeping place by night. Bedding could be folded and stored. Chests could serve as both storage and furniture. What mattered was not abundance of objects, but the intelligence of arrangement. This is another point where modern assumptions fail. We are used to defining comfort by quantity. More rooms, more furniture, more separation, more possessions. But in the Mongol home, comfort depended on proportion and order. Too many objects would have made movement difficult. Too much clutter would have interfered with heating, sleeping, and work. The house had to remain clear enough for the family to live fluidly inside it. Every item had a place because every misplaced item stole space from everyone. At the center, the hearth governed the rhythm of the house. Fire was not decorative, it was life. It heated the space, cooked food, warmed hands hardened by wind, dried dampness, and gathered the family into a circle of shared attention. Smoke rose toward the opening above, and light entered through that same crown. In daylight, that opening connected the house to the sky. In winter, it measured the weather. In rain, it required care. In darkness, it became a silent point overhead, reminding those below that even inside, they were still living within the terms of nature. Think for a moment about what that meant. In many later urban homes, human beings were able to forget the world outside. Thick walls, multiple rooms, glass, distance from animals, distance from weather. But in the Mongol jur, the line between inside and outside was managed, not erased. You were protected, but you were never fully cut off. The wind could be heard. The cold could be anticipated. The condition of the animals mattered. The season entered the house in the form of clothing, milk production, fuel, and preparation. Domestic life was not an escape from the environment. It was a disciplined negotiation with it. And because the space was limited, family life became visible. One could not disappear into another room. Labor unfolded before everyone. Children watched adults work not through instruction manuals or occasional demonstrations, but through constant nearness. They saw leather repaired, tack cleaned, milk stirred, felt stitched, garments folded, tools hung, meals prepared, guests received. They learned not only skills, but timing, when to speak, when to wait, when the house was in a working mode, and when it was in a resting one. In such a dwelling, education was not separated from living. It happened in the middle of it. This mattered profoundly in a society where mobility was normal. To move camp was not to abandon domestic order. It was to prove it. A poorly organized household would suffer when it came time to dismantle the jir, load animals or carts, travel, and rebuild. A well-governed household could transform itself without losing coherence. The walls folded, the poles were taken down, the felt was rolled, the rope was bundled, chests were secured, bedding was packed. The home disappeared from one place and reappeared in another, not as a copy, but as the same life made visible again. That is one of the most extraordinary things about the Mongol house. It teaches us that permanence can exist without immobility. The home was not sacred because it stayed fixed to a single patch of ground. It was sacred because the family carried its order with them. In a world of seasonal movement, pasture shifts, and political campaigns. This was not weakness. It was strength. The empire could move because the household could move. The army could travel because domestic life had already mastered portability long before imperial expansion magnified it across continents. But the GR was not only practical, it could also be beautiful. The wooden door might be painted. The interior supports could be colored with vivid designs. Chests and furniture might bear patterns and symbolic motifs. Fabrics, felt hangings, and carefully arranged possessions gave warmth not just in temperature, but in atmosphere. The round white outer form that might look plain from a distance could open into a surprisingly rich interior. This matters because outsiders have often mistaken mobility for roughness, as though people who moved could not love beauty. The Mongol world disproves that. Beauty lived in portability. Decoration lived where life was closest. Still, not all Mongol homes were alike. The basic structure could be shared across social levels, but wealth changed scale, material quality, and display. A modest herding family lived with restraint. Their GR was durable, efficient, and fitted to necessity. Felt had to be maintained. Fuel had to be managed. Storage had to be protected from damp and pests. Space had to be earned through order. But in the households of the elite, the same mobile principle could expand into astonishing luxury. Travelers who visited the Mongol world described immense tents and mobile palaces associated with rulers and noble households. Some were transported on wheeled platforms pulled by oxen. Their interiors could be lined with costly textiles. Their floors could be covered with rich carpets. Multiple accompanying tents, servants' quarters, storage units, and transport carts could surround them in such number that the camp itself resembled a moving city. To someone accustomed to thinking that grandeur must rise upward in stone, this would have been a shock. Here was magnificence that moved. And yet the difference between the poor herder's jur and the ruler's mobile palace was not a difference between house and non-house. It was a difference in scale, finish, and retinue. The deeper principle remained. Mobility was not beneath imperial dignity. It was one of its foundations. The ruler who traveled with a palace on wheels was not imitating sedentary kings poorly. He was expressing power in a language proper to the steppe. Wealth meant not only having fine things, but being able to move an entire world with you. This also reveals something human and often overlooked. The Mongol Empire was never composed entirely of people living in one identical way. Even at its center there were layers. Herding families on the steppe, aristocratic camps, military encampments, artisans, captives, merchants, administrators, priests and monks of many religions. And as the empire expanded, it ruled over cities, farms, fortresses, and old settled civilizations from northern China to Central Asia and beyond. Not every person under Mongol rule lived in a jur. Many lived in walled houses, urban compounds, or regional styles of dwelling inherited from older local traditions. But the symbolic heart of Mongol domestic life remained the mobile home of the steppe. That is why it is so important not to flatten the empire into one image. If you walked through Karakorum, the early Mongol capital in the Orkhon Valley, you would not see only tents. You would encounter workshops, storehouses, religious buildings, and more permanent structures linked to trade, administration, and craft. The city was a meeting point of worlds. Yet even there, the mobile heritage of the Mongol ruling culture remained visible. This tension between movement and settlement, between camp and city, gives the empire much of its distinctive character. It was never simply nomadic or simply urban. It could command both. Inside the ordinary home, daily life was shaped by labor that modern people often underestimate. The romantic image of horsemen racing across open country hides the truth that empires are sustained by households, and households are sustained by routine. Milk had to be processed. Mare's milk could be fermented. Meat had to be dried or prepared. Clothing needed sewing. Felt coverings required maintenance. Ropes had to be checked. Saddles and harnesses had to be repaired. Children were watched. Guests were fed. Weather was read. Supplies were rationed. A sudden storm could turn comfort into danger. A weak door, poorly tied felt, or neglected fuel supply could change the entire meaning of a night. Because the GR was warm, people sometimes imagine it as effortlessly comfortable. But warmth on the steppe was a skill. Fuel was precious. Ventilation mattered. Smoke had to escape properly. Coverings had to be adjusted. Openings had to be handled carefully. In severe cold, Every mistake became larger. If the felt was too thin, heat leaked away. If moisture entered and froze, discomfort deepened quickly. If supplies ran low, the house no longer felt like protection, but like a fragile shell against a season that could not be negotiated forever. Survival was built from many correct small decisions. This is where social differences inside the empire become clearer. Two families might both live in round felt dwellings, and from a distance they might seem almost identical. But one household might possess better felt, stronger wood, more livestock, thicker rugs, more reliable carts, more servants, more stored food, and more room to recover from misfortune. Another might live close to want. Their coverings could be patched and thin, their household goods fewer, their margin against a hard winter much narrower. Wealth on this step was not always announced by an entirely different kind of house. Sometimes it appeared in the invisible quality of materials, in reserve, in resilience, and that difference could change everything. A family with many animals had options: more milk, more wool, more transport power, more chances to rebuild after disease or weather. A family with fewer animals lived nearer the edge. One loss could become several. A weak season could lead to hunger. A damaged cart could limit movement. A poor quality felt covering could turn a storm into an emergency. Poverty in such a world was not abstract. It entered through exposure, through shortage, through the repeated pressure of conditions that did not forgive weakness. Even so, the Mongol home was not a place of constant misery. It could also be deeply social. Guests mattered. Hospitality mattered. Seating order mattered. Drink and food carried meaning. Entering another person's gyr was entering a moral universe. Behavior was read. Respect was visible. A host was judged not only by possessions but by conduct. In small spaces, courtesy became architecture. Where walls did not create privacy, manners created peace. Where rooms did not create rank, placement did. The household was not merely a shelter. It was a school of relationship. Imagine the evening. Outside, the light weakens across open grassland. Herds settle. Wind lowers and rises again. The animals are close enough to be heard. Inside the gyr, the fire has become the center of attention. Someone adjusts the kettle. Someone folds a garment. Someone mends leather. A child grows drowsy but is still listening. An elder speaks. The smoke rises upward into the dim opening. The door remains shut against the cold. In that moment, the house is doing more than keeping bodies warm. It is preserving memory, story, instruction, rank, habit, affection. The empire is far away in scale, but here its human core can be seen. Before there were campaigns, there were circles like this. That may be why understanding Mongol houses changes the way we understand Mongol power. Too often the empire is described only in terms of speed, cavalry, conquest, and fear. Those things were real, but speed requires support. Campaigns require logistics. Long-distance movement requires a domestic culture already adapted to transport, discipline, and minimal waste. The Mongols did not conquer half the known world because they were wild in a disordered sense. They conquered because they had learned over generations how to organize life under mobile conditions with extraordinary effectiveness. The house was part of that education. Even the shape of the gyr says something profound. It gathered hierarchy and cooperation into one visible form. No one in the family could pretend the household existed without the labor of others. The center belonged to all, yet not all places were equal. Men, women, children, guests, elders, servants, and belongings were arranged within a meaningful order. This was not modern equality, and it was not modern privacy, but neither was it randomness. It was a social design embodied in wood, felt, and fire. And above all, it was human. Too often, when people speak of the Mongol Empire, they speak only of khans and armies, as if ordinary life vanished beneath military history. But children still grew up somewhere. Couples still negotiated daily life somewhere. Mothers still stored food. Fathers still repaired gear. Old people still needed warmth. People still worried about weather, scarcity, dignity, and the future of those within their care. The gyr makes those truths impossible to ignore. It brings the empire down from the map and into the circle of a family. There is another detail worth noticing. Because the gyr could be dismantled and reassembled, it demanded memory of form. The house existed not only as a built object, but as knowledge. which piece connected to which, how the crown should sit, how the poles should lean, how tightly the ropes should hold, how covering should be layered against the season. The dwelling was partly material and partly skill. A family that knew how to rebuild its world was less vulnerable than one that merely inherited walls it did not understand.
In this sense, the Mongol house also embodied a philosophy. It taught that stability does not always come from mass. Sometimes it comes from adaptability. Sometimes the strongest home is not the one hardest to move, but the one able to survive movement without losing itself. That lesson belongs not only to the past, it reaches forward even now. We live in an age that confuses accumulation with security and fixed location with belonging. The Mongol GR offers another possibility.
A home can be light and still be serious. It can be portable and still be dignified. It can contain few objects and still hold a complete world. At the same time, we should resist romanticizing this life into something unreal. The Mongol home was elegant, but it was not easy. It was beautiful, but it was exposed. The same mobility that created strength also demanded constant labor. Nothing could be neglected for long. Materials wore down. Seasons changed. Animals sickened. Travel exhausted people. Smoke irritated lungs. Cold punished mistakes. Children were raised not in comfort detached from nature, but in closeness to risk. To admire the system honestly is to see both its intelligence and its hardship. This complexity is what makes the subject so compelling. A Mongol house was not merely a tent. It was an answer to geography, climate, economy, social order, and movement. It compressed an entire way of life into one circular form. In its walls there was wool from the herd. In its frame there was woodworking skill. In its doorway there was etiquette. In its hearth there was continuity. In its layout there was hierarchy. In its portability there was strategy. In its beauty there was memory. And in its daily use there was the quiet labor without which no empire, however feared, can survive. So what were houses like in the Mongol Empire 800 years ago? They were warmer, more ordered, and more meaningful than many modern people imagine. They were often round felt homes built on collapsible wooden frames, arranged around a central hearth, governed by invisible rules of honor, gendered space, and hospitality. They could be humble and tightly practical, or they could expand into astonishing mobile palaces of rulers whose camps stretched like moving cities. And beyond the steppe heartland, the empire also included urban houses, workshops, and permanent settlements that showed how Mongol rule interacted with older settled worlds. But at the center of Mongol identity stood the portable home, a house made not to deny movement, but to master it. To understand that is to see the empire differently. Its power did not rise only from battlefields. It rose from households that knew how to live with little waste, from families trained in cooperation, from domestic spaces that could become orderly again almost anywhere on Earth. The round home of the steppe was not a footnote to Mongol history. It was one of its foundations, and perhaps that is the deepest lesson hidden inside these homes. Real strength is not always loud. Sometimes it is the ability to create warmth in a cold world, to preserve order in small spaces, to carry dignity across long distances, to build a life that can move without falling apart. When we step inside a Mongol house, we do not merely learn about architecture. We enter the human center of an empire that once remade continents, and we discover that even vast history is finally held together by ordinary people, ordinary labor, and the fragile, stubborn circle called home.